Today we're going to be talking about the Rosenhan experiment. So before we dive in, it was created by a man named David Rosenhan, and here we go. So the Rosenhan experiment was conducted in 1973. Why he did this? Basically, Rosenhan, after a lecture, he wanted to test exactly how good psychiatrists were at diagnosing patients. And if people could really tell the difference between being insane and sane. So he came up with this experiment that he actually ended up testing out. And if all things are true, then he actually got really good results. So basically, the steps that they followed were as such. Simply put, he had people go in and pretend to be fake patients and pretend to have a mental illness, see if they would get diagnosed, and then put into psych wards. While they were there, they were going to pretend to be normal. Well, not pretend to be normal because they were normal the whole time, but they pretended to be, well, I guess, over their symptoms in a sense. They just acted normal and see how long it would take for them to get released. So, how this went was he had 8 experimenters. They were all going to report the same symptoms. And I believe what they did was they pretended to be hearing a thud sound, the sound hollow. I never really quite understood exactly what that meant by saying that they heard hollow, but a thud makes sense. So they were basically hearing a thud, and that's what they were telling people at these hospitals, is that they were hearing a thud and that they were hearing hollow. And so what this was doing was this was leaving the doctors to see, well, what could it be? So basically what they said it was all of them in all 12 cases, because they went to 12 different hospitals. Now, they all spread out. So not all of them went to the same hospital, and they all went on the way in different areas, and they were all from different backgrounds. And basically they all got admitted. 11 of the 12 cases were deemed schizophrenia. That's what they were diagnosed with from the psychiatrist. And one, I believe, was diagnosed with maniac depression psychosis. I guess they put it more mildly, but nonetheless, 11 of those cases got deemed schizophrenic just from hearing the thud and the hollow sound. So you can tell that they were probably really surprised that they were getting admitted into these psych wards. And so still on that study, their stay ranges stayed. So what they did was they pretended to hear those sounds, they got implemented into the psych wards, and while they were there, as soon as they got there, they would report that they didn't hear anything anymore, that everything was normal, and that the sound went away. They wouldn't hear it, so they would just act normal, be about their business, carry themselves like they normally would at home. So when you're looking at the whole thing, I think the shortest one that stayed there was only for a week, and the longest stay out of all of them was about 52 days. And when they were released, basically, what the doctors would say is that, their schizophrenia went into remission. They wouldn't say that they got cured of it or anything like that. They would just say, they're not showing signs anymore. But the interesting thing is, though, is even when they were acting normal, they would, on their notes, on their files for their stay there, they would say, patient is showing signs of, like, it was still in the realms of them having issues, but they were honestly just acting normal. Like for normal things such as like taking notes, because while they were there, they were taking notes on their stay. And so what their conclusion was, or what his conclusion to the whole thing was, is that psychiatrists really couldn't tell the difference between those who were sane and those who were insane. And so, as you can tell, well, not as you can tell, but the repercussions of that, though, once the results of the study was released, there was a huge community in the psychology field that were in an uproar, like, wait a minute, that can't be true, because everyone would believe that they are able to do their job and they do it wise, and they're able to tell the difference between people who actually have mental illness and those who don't. And so what that really showed was that his main hypothesis was true, that people couldn't tell the differences between the two, and which is really, really crazy. I didn't know much about this, and so when I was doing the research and I was looking at these different articles and stuff, it was crazy because the one thing that I found out that was really significant, at least more recently, and how I can see that playing out to be really impactful on like today's medical field, not just psychiatry or not just psychology, would be this study that I found. Not a study, but a case. Her name was Susanna Callahan. Cahalan. I really don't know how to pronounce it, but nonetheless, she was actually a journalist for the New York Post, and she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. But really, what she really had was like an anti-NMDA receptor thing. It was like something wrong with her immune system or something. And basically, she was showing all these signs. She was having all these things happen to her, and her brain was really, I guess it wasn't reacting right to the medication she was getting prescribed for her schizophrenia or something. And so what happened was she was misdiagnosed, plain and simple. She was showing a little bit of signs of something that could be something, and so they misdiagnosed her for something else. And what's crazy is, as the results of that, she actually wrote a book about it and about her experience about, and I think the book was called Brain on Fire. It was actually a pretty good book, and they made a movie out of it where it talks about how she was misdiagnosed and they couldn't really find a real issue because the medicine that they would give her for schizophrenia wasn't helping, and so it was this big journey that she went through, and that was just something that was crazy. And I think that's really important because when you're working in the medical field or something like that, and especially in positions where it's like a psychiatrist, or if you go to the doctor and the doctor can't really tell how you're feeling, and when the patient has to talk to them and tell them of how they're feeling and stuff like that, then that's a big impact. I think that it goes both ways, because if I can go into the hospital and tell them, oh, my leg hurts, and I'm telling them about this pain that I have in my leg, and they can't see anything, they can only really assume. And if I could easily tell them, like, hey, I fell off my bike, and ever since then I've been having a pain in my knee, I need something to manage the pain. So I can see where this gets dicey, because if I get misdiagnosed, I can see how doctors can make mistakes and they just go by whatever the patient says. And in that same sense, like, patients can get away with getting drugs from doctors. So I think what he was able to do with this experiment shed light on the fact that, well, if doctors aren't careful and if they're not being precautious and like following through with their diagnostics, they can either put people in a worse situation, or people can take advantage of that situation. So definitely important. And another important thing, the reason why I chose Susanna for like why it was still relevant or why it was significant for today was she also found out about the experiment done with Rosenhan, and because it was similar to her case, she actually went back to see the specifics and like the detailed descriptions and stuff, and maybe she wanted to interview a couple of people about it. And so she went through, and what ended up happening was she wrote another book called The Great Pretender, and that book's actually pretty good too, because it lays claims to Rosenhan's experiment not being really valid. Because when she went back and she tried to interview the people that participated in it, she couldn't find anyone, and none of the notes added up with what they claimed, or they were just missing. And so it really impacted how valid his study was. And so either way, even if it was valid or not, I think that it shed light on a predicament that could happen, and I could see it happening, and I can see a place where doctors could be misdiagnosing people, and another situation where patients could pretend to have symptoms and get medicines that they might want. That's basically where it ends there. That's the end of the presentation. But it's something to really look into. It's Carlos. Peace out.